Hello, myth lover. I'm Maria. Welcome to the Women and Mythology podcast.
Myths ground my experience often in a larger story. So they help me orient myself in times of change and uncertainty. And I think they do that exactly because they are uncertain. Myths are curious and ambiguous and uncomfortable, and they don't always provide this real clear story or idea, but it holds the container for us to process our experience.
Mythmaker Podcast Network.
Hello, myth lover. Welcome back. In today's episode, we wander into the creative territory where myth and daily life intertwine. It's a space where stories are not distant relics or fixed interpretations, but living companions, guides that help us make meaning in moments of uncertainty and change. I'm joined today by Dr. Stephanie Zajchowski, mythologist, writer, and founder of Soul Story Coaching. Stephanie invites us to approach myth as a conversation rather than a concept, an imaginal space we can enter, listen to, and be transformed by. I first encountered Stephanie's work through her collaboration with the Joseph Campbell Foundation, of which this podcast is proudly a part of. I've also followed her lectures at Pacifica Graduate Institute and her talks at Mythology conferences, where her reflections on imagination, sovereignty, and the feminine in myth have left a lasting impression on me. In our conversation, we explore myth as an orienting container in uncertain times, motherhood and the Demeter-Persephone pattern of descent and return, perfectionism as frozenness, and the Medusa-Athena tension with Pegasus as creative emergence, how tarot and archetypes support individuation and sovereignty, and a mythic blessing for beginning again. I hope you enjoy it. Let's begin. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, Maria. Oh, it's so wonderful to be here with you. Thank you.
I'm so excited for our conversation. And I want to begin by asking you about your personal journey into myth. So you started your journey from corporate marketing to a mythologist and myth maker, and that's deeply inspiring. You've spoken of how motherhood and returning to school marked a turning point for you. How did that shift from the world of efficiency and strategy to the world of psyche, of soul, of story happen? How did that transform your sense of self and your purpose as well as a woman?
Thank you. This was such a thought-provoking question and a joy to re-enter this moment in my history, looking back on it. I was always interested in myth, even as I was working in the corporate world. I was taking art history courses at the local community college. I volunteered as a docent at the art museum. I was researching myth in different ways. But it really was that motherhood moment that was a catalyst for that journey into myth. I have this really vivid memory of that postpartum time of nursing my newborn baby. And while I was doing that, I had the archaeologist Maria Gimbutas's huge Language of the Goddess book. It's massive. It's 8.5 by 11 inches, balanced on my lap as I was nursing my child. And it's just filled with these images of Neolithic goddess figures, just that generative and procreative power of the female body and the earth itself. And I was just captured in that. The experience of pregnancy and childbirth was captivating for me. I experienced my body transforming in ways that were out of my control for the first time in my life, and also really empowering. What I would look back and say, this consuming of the mother archetype, I was captured by it. So I found that experience powerful and humbling, and it really cracked me open. And so I wanted to know more. And so that started the journey into myth, into really diving deeply into myth. And through a series of events, it was like 7 years later that I went into grad school for mythological studies. And that set a whole nother trajectory forward in my own exploration. And when you speak of this shift from the corporate mindset to the myth mindset, it was disorienting. Certainly, I felt really out of place. Time moves differently in the myth world. In the world of depth psychology, it's a world I thrive in now, but it was an unknown world then, and it was very intimidating. But grad school really, it held me in the container to do that exploration. There's this alchemical image I often think of during that time where this alchemist is balanced standing on the world, the tip of the world, and pulling back this veil and looking into the universe. And so you're seeing kind of the inner workings of the universe in what I imagine is like a dance, a movement in a dance. And I think that was what the myth world opened for me. It allowed me to see a different world in a different way. So it left me more grounded, I think, in who I am as my own individual, weird, unique self and how that lives in the world. And it interconnected me with the world around me and the people around me. So it, in that sense, gave me a deeper sense of belonging. So I say all that, but I value the corporate world too and the gifts that gave me. And I thrive in that space of, that liminal space of standing in between those worlds and what each can inform the other. Yeah, a lot of transformation, but a lot of gleanings along the way in that process.
Thank you for sharing that. I resonate so much with a few of the threads you brought, looking at these ancient ancestral images, the Neolithic images of women, and experiencing that, remembering that in our own bodies, that abundance, that fertility that we go through during pregnancy and childbirth and breastfeeding and all those phases. And I wonder when you said, oh, it took me 7 years to go to grad school and study and pursue mythology. Can you speak a little bit about the courage, the strength, the decision of changing paths, choosing a new path? So many women might say and think, oh, it's too late. Why bother? It's too much work. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Yeah. It does take so much courage to change paths and trajectory. So after the birth of my first child, I was in the corporate world and I left for maternity leave. And I had a more difficult birth than I had planned. Let me say that. I am one that loves to make a plan. I'd taken the birthing classes twice. I had my birthing plan all laid out. The checklist was there. And all of that was just thrown. I had to let go of all of it in the process of giving birth to my child. And there was a difficulty in that I think was also part of how I would say fell into an underworld journey of my own in the myth world. But I experienced postpartum depression. And so part of falling into those depths, myth found me there too. So when I'm talking about looking through these books and going into these spaces, it was a space I went to for comfort, to try to find meaning in a world that I could not really control anymore. And so all of that was very intertwined in that 7-year experience of kind of walking through that experience of depression, of going through what I would say also an identity crisis with this career path I had laid out that was no longer fulfilling me in the deep sense that I needed for belonging in the world. And then what does that look like next? Where do I go from here? So those 7 years looked like a lot of exploring, a lot of trying to find myself and my journey along the way, which was a lot of having to let go and a lot of listening and a lot of things I was not quite used to before, where everything was laid out in a map. That led me through returning into the church, the Christian church. I was working in that space and exploring perhaps becoming a minister in that space, exploring myth and doing more courses and just trying to dive in. But all of it with this open idea that the universe would present a path when it was time and ready. And I think that's what took the courage. I wrote a lot about my experience with postpartum depression when I first started grad school, particularly around the myth of Demeter and Persephone, which is a mother-daughter myth. And I looked at that around being both, being the mother and then this innocent person walking along like Persephone is, the one that kind of is in and of her, like to herself and then being captured in that moment, like losing that identity of that single womanhood and falling into the mother and enthralled by that, but also a loss in that, and just really trying to parcel out all of the emotions around the postpartum experience. And what I've found in many ways was a lot of answers in those myths of how that process works and how it's all intertwined. And a lot of how I had to know my children first. Like I often tell my child, it wasn't until you were here that I got to know me. And I think I was finding myself in them.
That is so beautiful to get to know ourselves through them. And it is not through their journey, but it's just through their presence in our lives and everything we need to expand to become. I also love the myth of Persephone and Demeter, and it's such a fitting myth for motherhood because, as you said, we have Demeter here as an image for the mother, but we are also the maiden that was gone, that goes down to the underworld, right? That transforms, that also marries and becomes queen and gained so much knowledge of the underworld and the darkness, the shadow there. And it seems like myth appeared to you in those 7 years. It's interesting that 7 is such a woman's number, such a feminine number, right? Mythological as well. And in those 7 years, the mythology was a healing balm. And it's a lot of what I experience as well, myth as healing balm, as medicine for us. In your website, you write a quote from Dr. Ginette Paris that says, mythology shows us what it's like to be human. For listeners who perhaps are not that familiar with the work of mythology as a healing balm, mythology as a guide for our soul, would you describe a little bit the gift mythology offers to women, to seekers, to yourself as well, to those that are longing to live a more relational and creative life?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I love that quote. It's hanging up on my wall. That's why I put it on my website. Jeanette was one of my teachers, and her work is exceptional as she goes into archetypes and things of that nature. I think for me, when I read that quote, it's what it means to be human. Myths ground my experience often in a larger story. So they help me orient myself in times of change and uncertainty. And I think they do that exactly because they are uncertain. Myths are curious and ambiguous and uncomfortable, and they don't always provide this real clear story or idea, but it holds the container for us to process our experience. So in many ways, it tells me about the organization of human existence. Like it has an orienting principle about how to live in the world and live collectively in the world. And then it also, by putting my experience into that larger pattern, it gives me depth and meaning in my own everyday experiences. So it shows me an archetypal patterning that I can feel held in while I'm going through something, perhaps. It doesn't take it away. It doesn't fix it, but it helps me understand it. It helps me to make meaning in the experience of it. And so I think that entering myth sometimes is difficult because the stories are confusing. This is scary, or this is strange, or why is this meaningful? But learning to sit with the images, with letting them absorb and work with you, it'll come to you when you're in a moment, like, as I said earlier, in Underworld, where you're like, I know this story. I've seen this in places. I know what this is, and I can't see, and I don't know where I'm going, and the world is scary. But I know that underworld story, and I know there's rising from that. So it just gives that orienting sense.
I resonate so much with all of this. And myths do orient us. It's why, again and again, I want to bring so many different stories to my listeners. Because I don't know how you feel about this, but I believe we should have a wide repertoire of stories. One myth is not possible to define because we change so much. We go through so many different initiations, and one myth is not enough to hold all of that. And we need all these different stories to mirror our lives in some ways. One great aspect of your work, and I see that you have a upcoming course, is on perfectionism. And I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about perfectionism and what it does, especially for women, as my work is very much with women. So let's talk about, I'm sure it touches men as well, but in the context of women, how does perfectionism affect us? And if there is a myth that can help us soften or dismantle this perfectionist structure.
Yes, thank you. I am a struggling perfectionist, have always been, and arguably probably will continue to carry that with me. But I have developed a relationship with it at this point through working with it and working with it a lot in grad school. I think particularly for women in societies, often there is a very strong correlation between performing in a certain way or being shunned from the society as a whole. And so the fear of being excommunicated, it lays intertwined with the experience of perfectionism in the world. That's some of my sense of where I struggle with that. It's like the ultimate fear is being taken away, like everything goes away because I've messed something up. So I think that's a very particular thing with women. And it's also often so internalized within us that we struggle. I struggle to differentiate when it's perfectionism saying this or if it's me and my own psyche really, truly wanting this. So I think that is part of the struggle with a women's journey, particularly. I think when people say perfectionism, though, we all know what it means. I can feel it right now. It's like I'm frozen. I can't put a word on a document because I just can't get words out of my mouth, or I'm standing in front of a room and I'm frozen, or I'm just lost in indecision. I cannot figure out what's next because like I'm overthinking something or I'm going into it. So it's this frozenness, right? That we can't move because we're just too afraid to do something wrong. And it's just really, it can be horribly painful and debilitating and holds us back from life and living. There's shame in that. And then that's always the root of what I'm trying to get into with my own perfectionism. But I think one of the first steps is, like I was saying, differentiating when it's perfectionism's voice and when it's my own. And part of that is identifying it in the feeling. I'm going off on a tangent here, but I think that like when I'm frozen on the page or when I'm doing something like that, it's trying to not say, okay, it's not that you don't have anything to say, it's that perfectionism is holding you back. And so it's pausing and interacting with that emotion, with that energy. I'm thinking of ways that James Hillman, the archetypal psychologist James Hillman, tells us that at the core of our sufferings is an archetype, is something that's moving within us, that's knocking at our door and asking us to take a look. And so one thing he teaches is that we suffer, we work with these things until these emotions return as an image, until they start to reflect back to us. And we start to access the archetypes within. So I look at that as these struggles are really pathways into soul. And that's why when you're saying like myths that speak to those perfectionism, working with it, I'm looking at it in that way. What's visiting and what is it saying when it comes and what does it want from me? So in the course, we work with the image of Medusa, and I have really found a lot of meaning in that image. And there's so much in the Medusa image to work with. It's surely not only for perfectionism, but for me, that inhibiting of creative action, that frozenness, it feels like being turned to stone. And so, of course, the Medusa image is something that emerges for me and is meaningful to me. We engage with this myth of Medusa, and we allow that image to open up the experience of perfectionism. But I think there's also honoring the complexity of Medusa's story, which goes in many different facets. And I don't know that I want to jump down that rabbit hole, but I think it's also important that Pegasus emerges from Medusa's body, and that Pegasus is often a symbol for creative energy, for the creative impulse, kind of eros in the world around us. We work with these tensions in myth and within ourselves and giving them due, giving perfectionism, respecting the fact that it's here and that it's present, and finding ways to say, okay, can you step back and let the creative energy emerge so that I can be in the world.
This is so insightful, Stephanie. So many things come up. First, your choice of words when you say perfectionism gives us this frozen feeling. And when we think of our creative lives, that's exactly it, that frozen feeling. And what we know is for a psyche, for a soul to create, it needs to be warm. It needs to have moist. It needs to be the opposite of frozen. So, of course, to be frozen is poison. And then it also reminds me a little bit of perfectionism as a standard of beauty as well in our world. And this idea that beauty is frozen. I know that there's a very big movement around aging and the beauty of aging, but it's still not enough. And there's still this idea of also a standard of beauty that is frozen, unattainable. And when you mentioned Medusa, I didn't know that it was the Medusa tale that you used in that course. And that just rings so deep for me because I love the story. I worked with the story in different ways as well. And the birth of Pegasus and Chirosaur, the brother. So there's that warrior energy being born, and then the hopeful, light, inspiring, creative energy of Pegasus. All of that dualism, it's also very interesting, being born from her head, from her beheading. I love that. Thank you. Would you like to share a little bit more into Medusa and how you use that in your program?
Yeah, I could definitely. She's such a fascinating figure because of the ancient roots of the myth and the figure as a whole and the connection to Athena. And so we work a bit with talking about those myths, like working with those myths, but also the history of myth, like the way that myths hold history. Let me see how I want to say this. We can see through the myth itself of the Medusa myth, how it evolves and is changed through time as cultures change, as societies change, as history rises into different ways of being. So it's interesting, I think, to grasp that. And I work a lot with internalized mechanisms of control. So Athena is an interesting myth to work with as a Greek goddess. She's often thought of as she's born from the head of Zeus. So she's thought of as the daughter of the patriarchy in some ways. And she is also known for her strategy and her incredible skills of society, creating cities, doing all these powerful things. She has some perfectionism in her as well. So we kind of work with that. But it's interesting, too, that Athena is the one that creates the opportunity for Medusa to be beheaded. And so she is part of the destruction of Medusa. And Medusa is a very encapsulation of many things, but one is primal energies that are in the universe as a whole, known with the Gorgons and things of that nature. And so she's, in some ways, we kind of toy with this idea that she's trying to contain this kind of primalness in her, this inherent instinctualness in her. But she holds her closely, like she wears the head of Medusa on her aegis, on her armor. So she's always close by. And so there's this idea that I work with around we're trying to contain our inner selves so tightly sometimes that we solidify our creativeness just to fit into a world that we feel unsafe to be ourselves in. And so taking these myths and images and working with our own emotions through that experience and holding all of those tensions, like not letting anyone, not dispelling one, not destroying Medusa entirely, but understanding how those energies intermingle. And so that's how we interact and enter into those myths.
Absolutely. It's beautiful. And I love how you mentioned Athena maybe as a perfectionist. I worked with Athena before, and I can feel that energy of the perfectionist definitely there. although I never placed specifically that word to describe her. So that's a very powerful lens. And I love seeing it through this lens. If that would be Medusa, Athena, the dualism there, an archetype to express that perfectionism, do you have an archetype or a mythical image of a woman who is not a perfectionist?
That's interesting. That's curious because the initial, what came to mind to me initially was the Greek goddess Artemis, who is the wild one. Like, she's associated with wilderness and wildness, and she's in and of herself. She belongs to, she's not partnered, or she does not have children. Like, she is just in the world as she is. I think that it's curious for images of things that are not perfectionist. That's just interesting to me. Because the gods and goddesses are often the personification of deified perfection, but
maybe outside the gods and goddesses. Yeah. I'm thinking more mythical. I don't think within the goddesses we can find, because as you said, yes, the goddesses are very much, well, they want that perfection. That is, they all suffer from that curse of perfectionism. But how about outside the Greek gods and goddesses, or other gods and goddesses, and more folk tales, other myths?
Yeah. It is an interesting question. I think that certainly, fairy tales certainly show us that it's much less about perfectionism and much more about the journey, and it's messy, and it's what's coming to mind too is the Arthurian legend of Parsifal, who embodies this image of the fool initially. Parsifal is the descendant of a king, and he is a knight by birth, and it's just inherent in him to be a knight. But his mother scoops him up and takes him out into the forest and the wilderness to protect him from that life. She doesn't want him to be a knight. And so there's this interesting back and forth in the story of him, just these urges coming to him, but he's quite foolish about it because he hasn't been enculturated or anything. So he's just chasing after these things and seeing, and ultimately finds himself as a knight, but he doesn't grasp what that means. And so he's just clumsy about his whole process of becoming a knight in the Arthurian court. And it's messy and painful to watch, and yet inevitable to his journey, that he's going to become what he was born to become. It's the essence of who he is. It's just the stirring of his soul. But you watch him do it so messily that it's just an interesting story of not being a perfectionist, but ultimately it all works out for him. And he saves the wasteland, brings life back to the world. So he actually helps the society by becoming who he was intended to be. So I think it's a story about following that inner pull, even when it's really messy and confusing and frightening sometimes.
That's a great archetypal journey for that counterpart. For a woman who is feeling that shadow of perfectionism, and I work with a lot of women who describe feeling stuck between the desire to get it very right and the longing to be free, to manifest, to create. What would you say to someone who's caught in that tension, especially a creative or spiritual woman who's afraid to begin?
Yeah, this is I love this question. And I think the first one, and you're speaking to this, is just awareness that I'm caught in perfectionism's thrall right now. I think for me, it took forever just to be conscious of that. I would feel struggling thinking something's wrong with me because I couldn't move forward, or I couldn't see things differently, not really realizing what was at play, not really parceling out that was in a mechanism that was controlling and holding me back. So I think consciousness around that is key first, and honoring the experience. So it's stepping outside of that and looking at it mythically, I think, is important. Like we were saying, it's entering a myth and personifying the experience until it starts to maybe depersonalize it a little bit, recognize its existence. And I say that I do that mythically. I do that with dream imagery, but I also do it with a document on my desktop that's, okay, here's perfectionism's words. And if I'm frozen on a page when I'm writing, I open up that document and I just let it flow. I'm like, okay, say what you're feeling. And she's quite cruel, my perfection, these words that come out, but I allow her to have a voice and I let her have a presence in my life. And I honor it. And I say, okay, can you step back and let me just get some words on a page right now? And so I think honoring that tension, holding it, giving it some grace and empathy, instead of saying, I wish I wasn't like this or I'm broken. I think that was key in my journey too. And then lastly, it was that bit about taking the step. One of the things with perfectionism is just action. It's that fool image we were just talking about. It's the first card of the tarot is with the fool. And that foot is just dangling out there with a little knapsack, really just on a journey for foolishness. And yet it's that foolish step that takes you into the next space, into the what is great beyond that. And that's the thing. What's on the other side is wonderful. It's beautiful and it's yours alone. But you just have to take that courageous step forward. And so I also think of that, taking that step, and I have like mantras that I use. Like right now, my go-to is, what if it all worked out? Just opening up that possibility. And so if there's a frozen feeling, some kind of phrase comes to mind for me to just, okay, here we go. We'll see what happens next.
Can I share with you my phrase?
Yes, please.
It's from Clarissa Pinkola Estes, but I am so much in love with her work, and it's been my healing balm, those myths and that wisdom. And it says, I love my creative life more than I love collaborating with my own oppression.
Wow. Yes.
A woman who doesn't bring her creative life forward is most certainly collaborating with her own oppression. And for me, every time I hold myself back from expressing and living into my creative life, and I feel that I'm holding myself back because of this, either a perfectionism or a feeling of not being enough, I say that to myself. I love my creative life more than I love collaborating with my own oppression. And that really helps. And even, as you were saying, it's coming to mind here for me, all my creative projects around a woman and mythology, always I hold myself back first. And then I need to allow it to come forward as it is in so many ways. Take what is true of that inner voice and discard the rest. Take what is true, work with what I can, better what I can, but then move forward. And even with the podcast, for example, at the beginning, I wanted to look different and I wanted to have video and I wanted so many different things, and people ask for these different things. So that's also very hard. And I had to say at a certain point and say, no, stop with that idea of what is perfect, what is right, and work with what is true, with what is possible.
Yeah. And that's where stuff emerges that you never even planned. So that's the beauty of that process and letting go to it. So thank you for that. Yes. That's very powerful, to collaborate with the creative, not the oppressive. Love it.
One of the things you just mentioned in your previous sharing was tarot. And I am wondering if you can speak a little bit about the relationship between these two symbolic languages for you, myth and tarot. I know they talk a lot. And we can even add Jungian psychology, right, into that. So 3 different languages there. And how can they support individuation? And how do you weave these 3 different languages, let's say, into your work?
Yes, thank you. I like to parcel these ideas out a bit, just in my own mind, for my own kind of way of meandering. But I look at myth as I'm like wanting to do it with my hands, and I'm thinking I need to explain it with my words. It's something, it's expansive, it's large, like it holds a cosmogony, a way of being, like I keep saying, a way of being in the world. So it's a reality for how we exist in the world itself. And myths open us into these mysteries of existence, right? They provide systems of meaning for ourselves, for our inner work. And then they also open to the world around us, the universe, just all that is beyond. So there are these large, expansive mechanisms of entering into the depths. The mythologist, I'm thinking Joseph Campbell, he says that myth presents a universe in which the mystery is present, so that everywhere you look, a holy picture opening up back to the great mystery. So it's like myths just open us and expand us. So when I think of that, and then when I think of archetypes, which we find in myths, right? Archetypes are patterns. They're recurring motifs that appear in cultures and throughout generations. We just see these patterns like the fool that just comes up again and again, that fool and trickster energy. So they're collective psychic elements shared by the human experience. And we see these come up in myths, right? They're reflected back to us as images. Those two things parceled out a bit. The tarot to me has both. Like the tarot is really archetypal images at play. And the play of those images with you or whoever's interacting with them starts to tell a story. It starts to tap into the mythic realm. And so it's this interactive tool to engage in these archetypes and myths in its own language of archetypes. So I think that I enjoy tarot for that reason. I enjoy it as a tool to enter into these mythic and archetypal realms. And I think one of your questions was about individuation, working with that and that nature. And I think that is curious because I think my ideas around individuation keep transforming because I'm just real curious about that Jungian individuation process in the way that my perfectionist nature initially thought of it as linear. Is there a checklist for individuation? Do we get to walk this specific path and achieve a graduation gown or something? And it's become more of a circuitous process, circumambulating for me. And so I think when we look at things like myth and archetypes and tarot, they're all mechanisms to help me expand my own consciousness in the world. And I think individuation for me is that expansion. It's finding more amplified and deeper, expansive ways of existing in the world around me.
Thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. I would love to ask you about sovereignty, and if you could just add a few details on the quality of the sovereign for you. And what do you think it means for a woman today to reclaim her sovereignty? Sovereignty for me is, I've noticed that it's the common thread between all the stories that I share. They are about finding trust in ourselves again and the courage to live our own story. Because I've also found that there are as many ways to experience sovereignty as there are women in this world. And I was wondering, what does it mean for you? And what can tarot teach us if there is a card?
Yes, thank you. Yes. I love this idea that there's as many ways to experience sovereignty as there are women in the world. Thank you for that. I think that's compelling and fascinating. Yeah, let me start a bit with my ideas around sovereignty, and then I can go into tarot. So at its heart, sovereignty is royalty. It's the sovereign, the authority to govern and, in theory, protect a society so that its environment and life can flourish within that space. So when I think of inner sovereignty, I hold that same idea of the authority to govern oneself, to create a safe space in our own lives where we can have a creative life that flourishes in the world. So I think at times, immediate reactions, well, of course I govern myself. Like I make my own decisions. I do my own things. I know how to live in the world. And I'm speaking of it more on a deeper level, that sometimes we're unaware of how societies or even people have infiltrated our inner beingness or our idea of how we should be or behave in the world, or even what makes us happy. Like you were talking about perfectionism around beauty. This is what success looks like. We're given these things, or we absorb them from the world around us, sometimes unintentionally, and they start to govern our lives. So I grew up in a small town. I was in a small world, and I was told what to believe about myself for so long that honestly, I lost myself in that process. I struggled to find my own sense of self and my own voice because it was so defined by what I was told to believe around me. That was internalized for me. And I think many of us internalize sexism. We internalize perhaps even misogyny. We've just internalized what other people have told us to be in the world. In doing that, we give our power away. We give our creative power away because we allow others to have authority over our own being. Like you said, it's the reclaiming of that, right? It's finding that story within us. And some of that starts with dismantling what's already there. It's identifying, like, this isn't me, this is me. I think you were mentioning that a minute ago. You have to differentiate what's truly yours and what's something that the world around you or people around you have given you. And you'd get to decide what is important to you, and you get to discard the rest. So I think that is a process that is part of it. It's certainly what study of myth provided for me. It was an opening into other ways of being. If we're looking at these really powerful myths or these fairy tales where these experiences are showing women particularly, or goddess figures going through different things and coming out powerful in their power, it's profound. Like we were saying, the Persephone myth, she is queen of the underworld. So I think those are part of that sovereign journey of seeing that. I think in that ways, myth has opened up for me. But I think ultimately, when we talk about reclaiming sovereignty in ourselves and this inner sovereignty, I think it's just living aligned with your own values, your own inner knowing, and who you truly want to be in the world. And that's a lot of self-discovery always. I keep talking about this because I think it's something that's constant for me. It's like trying to figure out, like, when I feel deep anger, I know a boundary has been crossed. Something is saying that's not who I am in the world. And it's learning to listen to that and then learning to identify, what do I want to be? And taking that invitation to choose my own path, become the fullest version of myself. Even as that does defy authority systems around me or those around me that disagree with that. And there's many myths of defiance. So protecting myself, creating a container for myself to be who I am in the world so that my creative energy emerges. So when I think of images in the tarot, there's every queen and every area is a sovereign figure, a king too. But I think of the strength card for me. It's something to be sovereign in the world takes somewhat of a warrior archetype to channel to protect your inner life, to protect yourself, to be who you want to be in the world. And so there's courage, there's the warrior that protects that self, and then there's the strength to allow that person to emerge in the world, like we were talking about, to really put yourself out there. And it's ultimately a gift to us all when you are who you truly are here to be in the world. That's a gift.
Yes, it is a gift, isn't it? And as Maya Angelou said, when a woman stands up for herself, unknowingly, she stands up for all women. And I really see this when a woman claims her sovereignty, claims her story, claims her gift, her creative life. It's almost like there's a ripple effect. And those around who are touched by it, either because they're close by or because they experience the work itself, they feel inspired to do the same. I want to ask you a little bit about your soul story coaching. So that is rooted in the belief that the images in myth open into the mysteries of our psychology. And I see and explore myth in this way too. That's what my sessions are all about, my courses. And I would love to ask you, what kind of transformations have you seen emerge when someone begins to see their life mythically through this lens? That those that do the coaching with you, what are some of the transformations they experience?
So when I'm more in the personal life coaching aspect, often clients come with some kind of constriction in their life. Something's holding them back. Something doesn't feel right. They're in a space where the fullness of life is not able to express itself. So myths help us explore that deeper sense of living in the world, of finding images that really speak to someone, to give them a sense of belonging. And then that openness that I was talking about, that expansion into the world. So I think when you ask what transformation, I think that connection with certain images that speak beyond words, that speak more into soul, that are yours alone to carry, something that has captured you as a human being. It's living with those images. It allows you to open in different ways than you have before. And I think that is something you can see as a coach and witness, and it's beautiful and just wonderful to see someone expand into the person they can be in the world and living their energy. So in that sense, myth is expansive for those clients and that transformation. I think it's curious because I also work with creative clients and dissertation students who are working on their doctoral dissertations. And it's a bit different for them. For them, they're drowning in the creativity, right? They're in the creative process. It's overwhelming. There's too many ideas. There's too many directions, or the creative work is just untethered. And for these clients, it's helping them locate the myths and archetypes that are in their work. And those myths become an orienting principle for them, right? It starts to provide a structure and it stabilizes the creative process. So not in a way that constricts the creative process, but in a way that kind of holds it and allows it to form. In that sense, rather than being expansive, the myth kind of constricts and creates a structure for creativity to glow and become something in the world. So I think what's interesting about that sense of transformation is just how that helps the creative process come to fruition. That's just a joy to watch someone complete a dissertation or a creative project. But also it's pretty profound the way that myths can meet people where they are and be what they need in the time that they need it.
That sounds so powerful. And I was wondering if you could share a mythic blessing, something to a woman who is at the start of her creative or spiritual path, because she is bubbling with ideas and she doesn't know how to move forward, or she feels perfectionism is stopping her. What would you say to a woman who is at the beginning of her creative path?
Oh, that's beautiful. First off, you're right exactly where you need to be in the space that you are right now. My mentor, Dr. Christine Downing, she has a quote that I have hanging in my office, and her words are profound to me. She says, "It's in my experience that the myths we enter most deeply are not ones we choose out of some book of myths, but rather in some profound way, these myths choose us." And so I think my blessing would be to listen to that quiet stirring within your soul and have the courage to follow its call. It's not necessarily an easy path. Sometimes it's frightening and it definitely doesn't feel comfortable. But I truly do think following that stir is what takes you into the life that is awaiting for you and what it means to be truly alive.
That is so beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for those words. Is there any myth woven recently into your life that has brought you fresh insight or solace or guiding force?
Yes, it's not actually, probably not solace, but certainly interest. I'm working on a presentation for a conference at the end of the month, and I'm looking at goddesses of war and destruction, which I know sounds interesting in some ways, but I think the archetypes and myths hold multitudes, and it's the fullness of the archetype can have both wonder and danger. And I think all aspects are worth exploration. I'm looking at that destruction principle, but also the generative aspects that allow transformation. And just I'm finding meaning in those stories right now and in a world that feels in a process of transformation. And so I think that it feels resonant for me right now. I'm looking at the Sumerian goddess Inanna, who is war, but also love and fertility. The Hindu goddess Kali is death and destruction, but also regenerative aspects. And then a Christian apocalyptic figure known as the Whore of Babylon, who's, again, associated with the end of the world, but there's some generative aspects there as well. So those are the myths that are calling to me right now that I'm working with.
A very interesting triad. And lastly, Stephanie, I would love to invite my listeners to connect with your work. Where should they begin?
Thank you. Yeah, I think a great place to start is on my website. I have links to YouTube and different places where there's webinars and lecture excerpts and interviews. It's just interesting ideas getting tossed about, maybe some good entrance points there. And also a blog that kind of shows my way of finding meaning in the world through myth and through movies and just different things, just my own explorations. And then I have courses listed as well, courses like the Perfectionism course that I'm going to teach on my own, and then some that I'm co-teaching with colleagues that you can explore. And then, my coaching is there as well. There's a contact on the website for if that is of interest. Yeah, and I just so grateful for this opportunity to be with you here today and these discussions. It's just filling my soul to have conversations like this. I am so grateful.
Thank you. I'm the one who's very grateful for having you here. I'm going to make sure all the links you mentioned are on the show notes for our listeners. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And to our dear myth lovers, see you in our next episode. Until then, remember, your life is a story only you can tell. Stay close to what feels true and sovereign within you.